Okay, I think we best begin. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this UKRI sponsored Net Zero Week webinar. Today, we're going to be looking at sustainable materials for the packaging sector. I'm Bruce Adderley. I'm the director of the Transforming Foundation Industries Challenge, and we've sponsored some work that resulted in a report that James will talk about very shortly, and we'll discuss its findings through the panel. Now, the question is, why, sorry, James won't, Angela will. My apologies, Angela. I'm having a really good morning. Why, as Foundation Industries, are we interested in this particular thing? Well, the reality is that the Foundation Industries have underpinned our economy for decades and indeed even centuries. And as we look to the future and needing to make our society far more sustainable, focus on what we need to do to address climate change and hence our net zero targets. The reality is that these industries need to transform to be able to support their customer sectors to get them to the point that they need to be by 2050 and indeed beyond. So hence we've commissioned this work to look at the packaging sector. We also commissioned some work to look at the construction sector, which we discussed in a webinar 2 days ago and is available through the Innovate KTN website if you look up Transforming Foundation Industries. So today we'll look at the findings of the report that we've commissioned. To me, there's some absolutely fantastic, fascinating insights in there, and I'm looking forward to discussing them in the next hour or so. So if I can hand over to Angelique, and she'll introduce herself and the findings of the report.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Anjali Ramji, and I'm a technical consultant at Oakton Hollands. And we've recently published a report on the future of the UK packaging industry in collaboration with Velpack on behalf of Innovate UK. So just to give you a bit of background to what the foundations industry is, and just to give you a bit more flesh to what Bruce has mentioned, the foundation industry is made up of 6 sectors: cement, glass, metal, paper, chemicals, and ceramics. It encompasses about 7,000 UK businesses and employs around 500,000 people within the UK. It is worth about £45 billion, and it supplies raw materials for a multitude of sectors, including packaging, which plays a very key role to the UK economy. The foundations industry is the largest industrial greenhouse gas emitter and generates about 10,000 of UK CO2 emissions. And so a lot of these foundation industry transforming challenge issues is around how do we reduce these emissions? And to do that, we need to know the future demands. And specifically, our report looked at the future demand for packaging. With reference to that, 4 materials are at play. So we looked at glass, metal, paper, and chemicals. Just to give you a brief background about the approach we took, we used the futures approach methodology, which was developed by Shell in the 1970s. That helps companies and as well as government sectors really think out of the box of what our future will look like. And what we did is we looked at key drivers and lever characteristics as either political, economical, social characteristics, technical, legislative, or environmental factors. And the first step involved a literature review through academic papers, through articles, and just really understanding what industry was doing across the supply chain. We then had a project team ideation session as the team was quite big, and just to understand overlap and kind of learn from each other and get a general overview of what the industry looks like. We then did several interviews and studies with stakeholders across the value chain. And this led us to form about 5 different scenarios of what the world could look like in 2050. And then after that, we took these 5 scenarios to an industry workshop to really understand what the opportunities and challenges were around these sort of different scenarios. So to give you current context, climate change is already affecting every region of our planet in many, many different ways. It's intensifying water cycles, bringing intense rainfall. One example, the closest home is in my home country in South Africa, where we had intense rainfalls and it completely destroys homes and roads and just really affected so many lives. We're having much drier seasons in many countries, leading to a lot of uncontrollable wildfires. We've seen Greece last year. I think this year a whole lot of volunteer firefighters are on hand to fight a wildfire that happens this year. We've seen wildfires in California as well as in Australia. And along with this, we also have a massive issue with waste. And a lot of the litter, as we all know, is ending up in the ocean. The last picture is of the litter piling up in the Great Pacific, and it's known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And so there's all these little aspects of, okay, how do we deal with climate change and how do we deal with our waste issue? And the reality is, if we continue to consume the way we are, we will be the society that really has no change. And this will lead to an environment where we've overexploited all our resources. In this world, we've reached our limits to growth, and it's constrained by the resources available. There are water and food security issues, production of resources such as silica, plastic, and wood cannot meet our current demands. We continue to landfill as we've previously done and incinerate a lot of our waste. We manufacture intensively just to meet the demand that we have, and it's quite a growing demand as more people rise to middle class. Our human health and animal welfare is very much affected, and there's very much a shortage of virgin materials. And so to summarize, our material supply cannot meet our current demands. This is actually one of the scenarios we developed of our 5 scenarios. And to quote one of the members of our industry workshop, they said, it has become obvious that we cannot continue as normal. And government has also understood this. So they're slowly nudging industry in the right direction. In 2014, we had the packaging waste regulation, which had the aim of reducing the packaging waste going to landfill, as well as reducing heavy metal content within packaging. Most recently, we've had the plastic packaging tax, which is really about reducing the amount of virgin material used in plastic packaging and really pushing companies to think more about how do we include more recycled content. Pretty soon, we'll see the introduction of a revised extended producer responsibility scheme, which also encourages more recycled content, but also charges a fee for material that's really difficult to recycle. So this material is sort of like multi-material materials, such as the one used in a chip packet. And Scotland's also going to be introducing a deposit return scheme, which is when people pay a small deposit for a drink that's very much in a single-use container, often aluminium or plastic, and then they get the deposit back once it's returned. And if that's quite successful in Scotland, we can see it being extended to the rest of the UK. And so looking at all these policies and legislations going on in the UK, as well as different trends, we came up with 5 very different unique scenarios in terms of material demand. So the first one looked at reuse and refill schemes and how that will impact our future and what a future with that will look like. The next looks at, okay, if we consume the way we currently consume now with no behavioral change, but we have more sustainable options, we have better recycling infrastructure. The next one is around shorter supply chains to offset the pork, and it's about local farming, local greenhouse gases, urban farming. The 4th one looks at Industry 4.0 and how the 4th industrial revolution can really help us be more sustainable through different things like drones and artificial intelligence. And the 5th one is one I just covered about a very extreme scenario if we do not make any changes. But a lot of our participants did mention that it's quite unlikely as we're slowly nudging towards a different society. As this is quite a short presentation, I will only be focusing on 2 of them. So one is looking at reuse and one is looking at consumerism in a sustainable 2050. If you have any questions about the other 3, you're welcome to ask me in the Q&A or have a look at our reports, or even just drop me a message and just have a chat offline. So to look at the reuse first, we have a society that's community-orientated, collaborative, diverse, and inclusive. Our priority is a community well-being, therefore we actively contribute to making healthy living environments. We are conscious that our actions have an impact on others and the environment, and therefore we strive to live in symbiosis with each other as well as the natural world. We live in a similar urban rural built environment of that in 2020, except we have more communal green spaces and maintain close contact with each other. In terms of the environment, we've completely reduced the amount of waste we produce. The flow of packaging into the ocean has completely stopped, and the circular economy has been fully adopted into a reuse model. And a lot of the products we use, we retain within a cycle. And this is quite a valid scenario because we've already seen a lot of trends of reuse and refill. So for instance, there are companies like Loop who are looking at reusable packaging for a lot of fast moving consumer good products. There's a company in Chile called Algramo who has both mobile and retail refill stations. We're seeing in the UK plenty of retailers looking at refill stations and setting up pilot projects in some of their supermarkets. And there are big brands also trying to find ways to make their products refillable. One common example is Coca-Cola has a refillable Coca-Cola station in Sweden where they designed a can that actually keeps the CO2 from really escaping. And so what does this mean for material demand in this future? Well, there's a reduction in overall demand for packaging as consumers opt for a refillable option. But there'll be an initial surge in the demand for durable packaging. To facilitate the refill and reuse culture, there is a focus on durable monomaterials and high-performance composites. Reuse systems require a systems thinking approach. As refill and recovery infrastructure is of course needed, innovation focuses on durability through additives and common materials. Packaging is very much standardized and there's emotional durable design in it so that people want to keep their packaging. In terms of how this affects the foundation industry, after the initial surge, there will be a reduction in the requirements for any of the materials within the industry. And what can be expected is just packaging standardization across different brands so that you have the same sort of packaging for ice cream or everything, so that when we have sort of collection schemes, it's easier to sort. There's very much a focus on durability and there's a development of completely new infrastructure. Now looking at 2020 consumable in a sustainable 2050, we have a society that still values convenience and enjoys our habit of on-demand consumerism, but with appreciation of the environment and any potential impacts we might have. We trust that there's no adverse impacts of discarding our packaging, and we're more knowledgeable about how to actually dispose. There's clear labeling and it's very easy to kind of recycling. There's new packaging innovations such as edible packaging, and maybe there's more compostable sort of packaging. In that world, in terms of the environment we live in, we have sort of areas where we're keeping it safe, we're trying to live within our planetary boundaries, but because of the rise of other materials, you might find that there are some sectors that are still overexploited. So in the case of biomaterials, we're farming for food as well as biomaterials now. And what does that mean for overexploitation of farming? Current trend that speaks to this is the growing bioeconomy, such as compostable plastic bags. There's a lot going on. If you go to a supermarket, it's not surprising to find a compostable plastic bag. Sorry, give me a second. I'm losing my voice here. There's a lot more R&D into chemical recycling, and a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how to really chemically recycle really difficult plastics. I know that I was busy on a carpets project, and they're looking at how to chemically recycle nylon 6 in carpets so that you can have a fully circular carpet. And we also have all these really amazing innovations with using other materials. So there's like edible packaging. So there's a edible water bottle where you can just eat it. And that's like a really good innovation for countries where you cannot drink the tap water. What this means for packaging demand is that recyclability is the focus. There is a focus on recycling durability. Bio-based packaging is also very prevalent in the society, including bioplastics such as polylactic acid, is biodegradable and compostable materials such as mycelium or seaweed, as well as edible packaging mentioned. Biocoating can also be used in food to preserve it for longer, and biomaterial is very much produced at scale. Chemical recycling and biowaste streams recovery infrastructure is present all over the UK and quite easy to use. And we've reduced the amount of fossil-based material, and that's being replaced by more sort of sustainable options. What can be expected is there's a focus on chemical recycling, materials is sourced from recycling plants and natural resources, and there's a change in demand for chemicals where there's more of a focus on monoplastics that are much easier to recycle than sort of composite-based plastics. What this means is we're going to have an increase in demand for paper because that's quite easy to recycle. Metals will be a decrease just as we focus more on lightweighting to reduce delivery costs. Glass will remain relatively the same. Chemicals, there'll be a reduction in the demand for virgin chemical material, but there might be an increase for other sort of materials such as polylactic acid. So it's looking at what other material is coming up, or it's looking at material from recycling plants, and that's where the increase comes in. So just to go over the other two sort of scenarios that we looked at, but not going into too much detail. The first one was augmented circularism. So this is a technology-enabled world where we have convenience, such as online shopping, with sort of artificial technology and drone delivery. One really cool example is using AI to kind of try on clothing so that there's a reduction in returns and reverse logistics needed for clothing in the fashion industry. Or there's drone deliveries where drones can take back packaging once a product has been delivered to consumers, as well as say robot food delivery where doesn't need to be extra packaging to keep food safe, keep drinks from spilling when it's being delivered to consumers. And the last one is doorstep to fork, which is probably sort of my favorite world and where I would want to live in, essentially where you have local urban farming and everything is farmed off our land. We have renewable resources that power greenhouses, and we don't rely heavily on imports from other countries for our fruits and veg. And because of this, there's less transit packaging. And it's just, we're utilizing more of our space within our roofs. There's like gardens there, and it's just living off your means. From this scenario presented, experts believe that our future will consist of a combination of those two that I went to detail: past sustainable 2050, as well as reuse evolution. They believe there'll be more reuse and refill options, but also they believe that we'll have a high chemical recycling rate, we'll have a lot more biodegradable material and bio-based packaging. And this means that the type of material used and how we source raw materials for packaging is likely to change substantially in our future. But how do we get there? In order to get there, we have several challenges we still have to face. One of them is government don't really motivate to change. Current targets are around recycled content. And so if we have legislation that speaks more to reuse and refill and other sustainable materials, we can push the industry towards that sort of area. We completely need public to change the way we consume, whether it's changing how we consume normal goods and doing refills at our stores, or getting to use our bins properly and actually putting the right products in the right bin after we've done with them. We need to develop business cases for a lot of these innovative materials and technologies coming out there. All of these are really cool, snazzy ideas, but we need to find business cases and need to find out how to make these things possible. There's also a lot more research that we need to do in terms of energy demand for manufacturing, specifically new material that are coming onto the market. When you look at logistics, if our logistics change, especially if we have refill or reuse, and there's a whole sort of system behind that, how does that logistics look? What is that energy demand? And a lot of chemical recycling currently is very energy intensive. Are there ways of mitigating that with newer technologies, with current technologies, or is it that we need to avoid recycling certain things and only recycling others? As well as every industry is also looking at net zero. And so there'll be a competition for resources. Right now, I think there's a shortage of recycled content for, I think, PET, and it's just going to get worse as more and more industries try to incorporate recycled content into their product. Having foresight into the future is key to policymakers looking to introduce legislation and regulatory mechanisms to help facilitate or prevent certain scenarios. Equally, leadership and collaboration across the supply chain is key to ensuring the path to the preferred future is supported and realized. How do we roll it out and scale? That's what we need to focus on. And so one of the things you can look at is looking at best practice in the sector and really finding out how can we collaborate to work together to walk towards net zero. I think from what we've learned, it's very much a team effort. We need to collaborate across the supply chain, across different companies, across competitors, so that we can reach net zero within the packaging industry as well as in the foundation industry. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anjali. I know there was an awful lot contained within the work of your colleagues of what you've done, and you've only had a chance to give us the briefest of overviews. And yet there's so much even within that 10 or 15 minutes that you've given us. There's a whole hostess of things for us to discuss as a panel in the coming minutes. For those of you online who've been asking about, is the report available? Will these presentations be made available? In terms of presentations, well, this webinar will be made available almost immediately after we finished via the Innovate UK KTN website. They have pages that are focused on the foundation industries. And as I think I said earlier there, you can also find the webinar that we did looking at the need of the construction sector in terms of materials in 2050 that we talked about on Tuesday. The reports will be available very shortly, again, through those pages. You'll either be able to find them through Innovate UK KTN or directly through the UKRI web pages if you look for transforming foundation industries. Right, so we'll move on. I think originally in our agenda, I was due to ask Nick next. So apologies, Nick. I'm going to ask James to go first because I know he was involved in, to an extent, with putting the report and the findings together, and I'd like his perspectives to add to Anjali's first, if that's all right, and then I'll come to you. So James, could you introduce yourself and offer us your views on what we found out?
Yeah, I can do. Thanks, Bruce. I'm James Skidmore. I'm the head of the consulting team at Valpak. Valpak are involved in packaging, for those of you who don't know, because first and foremost, we are a packaging waste compliance scheme under the current packaging regulations, and I'm sure we'll have a role under the future EPR regulations as well. But we're also a lot more than that. In particular, in this area, we're a data provider, so we help obligated businesses first and foremost to produce their packaging waste returns, but more and more that data is being used for other things: internal reporting, voluntary reporting, kind of reporting into other NGOs and pressure groups and so on. So it is an interesting space. There's a lot going on, and we deal with the packaging data and compliance for a number of the for over 30% of the UK obligated businesses, the large supermarkets, and a number of the big FMCG companies as well. So that's a bit about Valpak. The area that I work in is a small consulting team who bring our data expertise, contacts, and so on to projects like this, which we really enjoy doing. I think Angela gave such a good overview of the two scenarios. I don't think there's any point dwelling on it. What I find quite interesting is about how we got to this point. And I was just going to quickly mention a bit of the report that we did, which was around kind of lessons from the past. So as well as, I mean, obviously I want you to all focus on the future, but knowing how we got here can inform. So it's a relatively minor part of it, but I found it to be quite interesting. So I was just going to sort of explain really. It is complex. Packaging is complex. It's driven by loads of different factors, which are almost all completely forgotten in kind of social commentary. So packaging is important. It protects product from damage and contamination. It intrinsically links to reduction in waste, and in food, and from an environmental viewpoint, that's really important. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. The other functions that it performs include, aiding efficient transport, increasing those own transport efficiencies, and relaying information to the consumer. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. And in fairness, that the respondents that we spoke to, sort of industry don't, but in the narrative, the popular narrative around, packaging is applied for the sake of it. There's no thought. It's easy. It's lazy. It's all plastic. All that. That's obviously not the case. So clearly things need to change, but it is complex. There's a whole range of influences 30 years ago, but way beyond that, obviously. We've seen change driven by kind of three main areas in recent times. That's particularly around provision of services, waste services to waste generators. So we're seeing this kind of change in collection technologies and sorting, recycling technologies moving on. And so on. So the second thing we've seen around that kind of idea of the sort of for the package put on for the sake of it kind of narrative is that industry has taken action. There has been this movement. There's been collective endeavour. There's been individual initiatives. The Court Hold and Plastics Pact initiatives that RAP have undertaken are genuinely, I believe, world leading, and so that shouldn't be forgotten. So there has been this movement, and there is this evidence that working together we can all move things forward. And the third thing that we have seen, and particularly a pandemic issue, is that things have changed. They changed so quickly, and they change increasingly quickly over time. I mean, I never envisaged seeing a 16-kilo bag of flour next to a supermarket entrance, but the pandemic came along and we all took up baking, and there it was. And some of that sort of stuff happens. Before that there was kind of the blue planet effect, with people really caring, hopefully caring for the long term about what they're producing. I was going to really quickly list off the 6 areas that our stakeholders kind of highlighted to us as being things that we should learn from in the past and apply to the future. The first one is around society and society's awareness. The second one was around technology and packaging development and the need for collaboration and, to an extent, commonality. The third area is environmental pressures that Anjali spoke so well on already, of course. There was also mentioned the role of policy in shaping history, and the role of policy therefore in shaping the future. we spoke to stakeholders around economic factors being this directional driver for packaging in the past and therefore in the future. And then, of course, we also discussed the role of legislation and evolving, changing and evolving legislation as well. So there are lessons from the past. We do want to concentrate, obviously, on the future, but I think there is some real interest there. And with that, I've probably gone well over my time. I shall hand over to, I think, to Nick next, or back to Bruce. Thank you.
Oh, we can move straight on to Nick, if you're all right, Nick.
Yeah. Morning, everybody. So where to begin? I was really sort of, let's begin by introducing myself. For those of you that don't know, my name's Nick Cliff. I work in one of the other ISCF challenge programs. So obviously this report was prepared and funded and developed by the Transforming Foundation Industries. I sit in a challenge called Smart Sustainable Plastic Packaging. So of immense interest to myself, and the challenge is this report and the work that's gone into it, and the findings are very interesting insofar as they help us to sort of confirm some of the things that we've been finding, the directions that we're going, and the innovations that we're seeing. But also, it's a slightly sort of narrower window, as the challenge suggests. I mostly worry about plastic packaging. It's not to say metal packaging and glass packaging and paper packaging doesn't have its place. It's just not as exciting to me, really, other materials. Paper grows on trees. No. Anyway, so really sort of quite interesting to see that the range of different scenarios suggested and how that fits with what we're seeing, particularly with that sort of slightly narrower focus on plastic packaging. And of course, it's always good when you come to one of these events to think that, yeah, broadly, I agree, I think, with the ideas presented in the scenarios, the findings, and what I think will result in particularly from the materials perspective. So obviously, the sort of the baseline scenario, nothing changes. I mean, it's all too easy to imagine. If history tells us anything, it's that perhaps the thing that humanity is the best at is consuming, and huge amounts of our innovation is driven towards just doing consumption better. But again, I think as both the previous speakers and the report says, this is definitely changing, or it's a pivot point. There's a real opportunity to change how we do this. Change our relationship with packaging, which means changing the relationship with the materials that make up that packaging. So again, we come on to the sort of scenario 2, the more sort of continuing to consume, but doing materials better, consuming materials better, and recognizing the role that innovation and technology can play in getting that better material outcome, moving towards that circular economy, where once we've gone to the time, effort, and trouble and cost, particularly cost, both in terms of resources and energy that it takes to make these materials in the first instance, not simply throwing them away and not doing something as simple as getting a bit of the energy back through incineration, and possibly, potentially, almost certainly releasing a lot of material in the form of the carbon and the oxygen into places where we don't want it. And it's definitely backed up. You know, the report talks about the importance of better recycling systems. We're seeing and we're investing in projects that are trying to crack and mainstream the chemical recycling approach. Lets us take a wider range of plastics, return them back to valuable feedstocks, get them in use again, rather than seeing them lost to landfill or energy recovery. On the biomaterials, all sorts of questions there, but we're definitely seeing innovation in that area. Perhaps even bigger questions about, you know, how we treat those at end of life. We don't just need the infrastructure and the capability to produce biomaterials from feedstocks alongside food and all the other things we need, but we're desperately short in this country of infrastructure that can actually biodegrade them. It's great to have biodegradable materials as long as you can biodegrade them, in a safe, responsible, productive, and hopefully profitable way. What we're seeing as well at the cutting edge, which I think is interesting in linking between the scenarios, is we're starting to see the emergence of bio and chemical recycling approaches being brought together. So some of the work you'll see is the discovery of microbes and enzymes that are very good at breaking down plastics, potentially even stitching them back together. And starting to see, although we're a few years off yet, how we can bring together all these technologies again to cycle those materials and develop those next generation of biomaterials that can hopefully give us all the properties we need, but at the sort of a cost that we can bear as a planet. We go on to the reuse scenario, which I do think, I agree entirely, definitely coming, but there's lots to work out. All too often we're told, oh, reuse is easy because we all used to use milk bottles. And to an extent, that's true. We can demonstrate that this can be done utilizing glass, but mainstreaming reuse, lots of challenges there. There are materials challenges. We're very good at addressing those, but there's more. There's commercial challenges, there's economic challenges, there's infrastructure and logistics challenges, everything to play for. Some of the most interesting work we've been doing is actually around changing consumer behaviors. How can we facilitate, make reuse and refill options simple and acceptable? Who would have thought that we'd be funding projects which were literally seeing how beat up or scratched a container will be before consumers start to get nervous about using it. As it turns out, we're much more accepting of our own scratched up, bashed up Tupperware than we are of scratched up, bashed up Tupperware that someone might try to give us in a food service restaurant. But through coatings and materials innovation, we can make those durable materials so we get that sort of customer acceptable status. I think like Anjali, is it scenario 4, scenario 5, the farm to fork, it's definitely my favorite too. This idea of small localized systems, but of course that requires you to be able to grow enough food and enough diversity of food local to you. And what we're seeing across the planet in terms of climate change, water pressures and other means that that's not going to be possible everywhere. So much as I like the idea and the concepts and some of those things in that scenario, and we are funding some things in that area, I don't know how that fits against, a global population measured in the billions and the climate pressures that we're facing. But I think there's a lot we can learn from it. And I think there's lots of opportunities to do stuff better. And I think there is some appetite to go in that direction. Always notwithstanding what the current sort of consumer prices, confidence collapse, cost of living increases are going to do for retailers who are the pivotal part of this to change the way they model. And last but by no means least, the sort of the scenario 5, the smart materials. Again, we see a lot of innovation in this area. I'm not sure I would necessarily see that as a viable future, nor is it sort of suggested as the most likely ones. I really see that as an underpinning sort of suite of technologies, better, smarter packaging that we can track, that we know where it's been, we know what it's been used for, we know who's got it, we know when they've returned it, so we can build economic models and we can encourage behaviors that drive us being able to reuse this stuff, keeping a better track of the materials so we can draw every last drop of value out. So just in closing, I think the report is really interesting. I think the scenarios have certainly given us in the challenge quite a bit to think about. I know that we'll be using it to go out and talk to our stakeholders and decide where we go next. And yeah, looking forward to seeing, hopefully I'm still here in 2050, be able to see just how right it was. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's been a fantastic perspective on the scenarios that the work has drawn out and given us huge food for thought over. And it's definitely an area that I'd like to come back to when we convene as a panel in a few minutes' time. So finally, I'd like to ask Paul Vanston to give his perspective on what you've seen as the work and the findings of the report. So Paul, you could introduce yourself and pick up, that would be great, thank you.
Good morning to fellow speakers, to UKRI and also to our audience. My apologies that I was visible in this panel rather late this morning, nothing to do with me, technology. UKRI colleagues tell me that Zoom introduced a new innovation yesterday, which is actually causing system damage. Probably a lesson there that innovation might sometimes have a rocky start. My name is Paul Vanston. I am the CEO of the Industry Council for Packaging and the Environment, gratefully shortened to INCPEN. And I'm just going to give a few big picture perspectives because I think colleagues have already, from what I've been able to hear, which I apologise wasn't all of it, been able to highlight what's in the report. I've got 5 things, Bruce, that I'd like to highlight. And the first one is this. I see and speak to a lot of people in my job, in manufacturing, in brands, in retail environments, recyclers, reprocessors, and across the rest of the value chain for packaging. No one seems to be in a comfort zone anymore in terms of their job. Everyone's job seems to have got harder to do in recent times. So firstly, if anyone's listening to this who feels that their job has got harder to do, let's all just recognise that that is the case and support each other. And secondly, a massive thank you from me and others in the industry for all of the work that you do within the packaging supply chain. It is very, very much appreciated despite these difficult times. So that was my first thing, a big thank you. Second thing, why have things got harder? Well, we had a long period of relative supply chain stability, lasting not just a few years, but relatively quite some decades, and where the focus throughout those decades was on finessing resource efficiency. We now moved into a new period, not just because of the pandemic, but other things as well, a new period of what looks like supply chain upheaval. The economy is much more fragile than it was, and the focus doesn't seem so much now to be able to be fully on resource efficiency. It now seems to have moved on to the tricky area of resource security. And that is as much to do with the geopolitics that's happening around the world at the moment. I don't need to rehearse it all, but for the first time in many decades, we have a war in Europe. And we need to recognize that that is having an impact on supply chains. And it's got harder to secure the materials that we need in the UK to support our economy. We're having to go to new markets. We're having to go further afield. That means that their supply chains have become longer and certainly less smooth. They've become disrupted, upheaval. And of course, all of that impacts on things that we care about around resource efficiency, which is carbon emissions. And the supply chains as they are now, they're less resource efficient than where we were. So I think we have to recognize that that is also a reality, possibly not just for some months to come, but maybe for some years to come. And I say that with no relish at all. Thirdly, talking about resource security, we have a resources and waste strategy in this country, a resources and waste strategy for England and similar strategies for the devolved administrations. And of course, they largely focus on resource efficiency and what we do with materials once they've been discarded. What we don't really have in this country is a resources security strategy, how we secure the nation's materials to begin with. And we need one. And this conversation is now taking off in a bigger way for all of the obvious geopolitical reasons that we can understand. So that is a third reality I think we've got to face up to. The fourth one, the big picture, already mentioned by at least Nick, and probably by other speakers who I wasn't able to listen to, sorry for that. It's the impacts of the legislation and other government interventions. It's not just legislation that governments can use. There are at least 5 different areas of intervention. And that legislation is happening domestically and internationally. And in respect of the UK, we have 4 governments who each have their own sovereignty over legislation relating to resources, material supply. And what we're finding is that that's creating a bit of a tension at the moment. My observation is that the UK single market, where anything that's legally made manufactured, including the packaging in one part of the UK, should be able to be sold and used in all other parts of the UK without question. It's our version of the EU single market. We have a UK single market. We've had it for decades, a long time, though we may have taken it for granted because it's always just been there. Now that the policy is being made on the flow of goods, what packaging can and can't be manufactured, what packaging labeling must look like according to the 4 different sovereignties within the UK, that's really testing now that principle of the UK single market, to the point that if you're a packaging manufacturer, a retailer or a brand, we might start to see such chipping away at the UK single market that your decisions won't just be about what is manufactured, but also whether and where you can sell it because of those challenges to the UK single market. Linked to that is another big question, which is what is an optimal amount of packaging, of materials, to deliver what citizens need? And I just did a little exercise. Seeing this report prompted me to just have a little look back over the 10-year period between 2011 and 2021. And it was interesting. Back in 2011, and a lot of this data, in fact, nearly all of it, I think is from Valpac. So thank you, James and the team, for what Valpac does. Going back to 2011, just over 9.3 million tons of packaging serviced the needs of the UK economy, and therefore what citizens' needs are as well. Very interestingly, despite all of the discussion about plastics, and a lot of that needs to be had, of course, some 62% of all of the packaging back in 2011 was paper and paperboard and glass, a very significant tonnage out of the total. Taking that up to 2021, what was the 2021 picture looking like 10 years later? Well, firstly, the overall amount of tonnage that the UK used to service the needs of the UK economy rose. It rose by just over 7%, 7.4% to be specific, from 9.3 million tons to just over 10 million tons. You might think that's not a great thing that it's seen a rise, but we have to remember that population rises as well. And the population rise over that 10 years in the UK was 8%. So in some respects, a little bit of a pat on the back, not too big a pat on the back, but a little bit of a pat on the back for the packaging industry, that we have made packaging materials go further in servicing the needs of the UK. The population rose more than the tonnage did. And of course, that's tonnage, whether we look at this in terms of carbon or other metrics, also entirely valid. And again, what was the paperboard and glass share of that? Well, that actually rose as a proportion of the total from the 62% of the total back in 2011 to 64.5%. And it won't surprise you to hear that on the plastic side of things, just to give this figure, it was 20% by tonnage of the total in 2011. And that went down slightly to 18.9% as a proportion of the total in 2021. And those trends might confirm some of the things that you, the audience, may have been seeing for yourselves. And fifthly, my last point is this: we just mentioned citizens, and I will say this, that citizens really do seem to be demanding more authenticity, anti-greenwashing of companies and of governments. But if I can be bold for a moment, citizens don't necessarily always have such demands of themselves, of authenticity. How do we know that? Well, if citizens were truly as authentic on their status, on environmental status, as many of the companies are, then we wouldn't quite see so much litter. I can go out into Maidstone High Street now and I'll guarantee you that there will be litter. Indeed, I went into WH Smith in Maidstones only a few days ago to find on their lovely wooden floors in WH Smith, spattered, I mean, it's disgusting, but spattered from door all the way through to the back of the store with chewing gum that's been spat out by people, which of course is litter, in WH Smiths on their lovely wooden floors. So we wouldn't quite see so much of that. And we'd also see higher recycling rates and greater take up of reuse, which of course features in the report heavily. And in terms of the report, I have to say I was reading through it and I was wondering, well, what type of scenario do I fit in? What type of person am I? What do I feel I am now and where do I want to be? And I suddenly came to the realization that it was something, I was looking at those options as to realizing I can make options based on what I can afford to do in my life. And I had that ability to do that. And it made me realize that with a cost of living crisis as we've never known it in this country, certainly not for the last 40 years. So for many of you in the audience, if you were born after 1982, you will have never seen inflation at the rate it is now, nor a cost of living crisis as we've seen it. And I think for me, one of the big things that come out of this report, now that we've seen the events over recent weeks and months, is how do we support citizens to do the right thing when doing the right thing might not be what they can afford in the future? And sorry to end on a bit of a sadness there, but I think these realities, these big picture realities that I'm trying to convey today, running alongside the report, are probably how we have to deal with things over the next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I mean, these are absolutely the sort of questions that we need to face, you know, as we look at both this focus on packaging and many wider parts of our society and where we're going economically. I'm going to start the panel discussion session now. We've got a couple of questions in that mostly focus on recycling and the ability of various market players to be able to move to using recycled packaging. But first, I'd like to pick up really from where Paul left off. He was asking himself the question, what do I see in terms of myself? You know, where do I think I feel I fit in terms of these 5 scenarios? And I did very much the same when I had a first chance to look over the report. And I say I recognise in myself that I'm very heavily an adapter, and arguably somebody who's heavily involved in innovation shouldn't be saying I'm an adapter, not an innovator. But you know, just my starting point is generally that. And so when I look at these scenarios and I look at the tentative conclusions so far and the discussions that on at the workshop, that people involved in that thought some combination of this part sustainable 2050 and the reuse evolution, if I can say that right, future with it was the most likely outcome. I think I tend towards that as well, but I think I also need to test myself and say, is that just because that's the way I naturally think and I'm not pushing myself? Yeah. So what I'd like to ask all the panelists is, do you kind of agree with the findings so far that you think those are the most likely scenarios that we're heading towards, or is there a reasonable chance that one or two of the others will have a bigger part to play than perhaps the report indicates at the moment? I'll go to Nick first, if that's all right.
Sure, Bruce. Yeah. Well, so like I said, I think I agree broadly that somewhere between the using materials in better loops, but still with a lot of, you know, one use per cycle, and an increase in reuse, refill, or in fact, as we're seeing again, pre-fill, where you as a citizen are still picking a full package of something off the shelf, but rather than that package would then get reused. So you're not looking for too big a change in consumer habits, at least not initially. You know, we see everything, you know, in-store refill, in-store pre-fill. I think those are right. I think, as I said earlier, I think the smart packaging underlying the industry 4.0, those sorts of approaches, I see them very much as enabling those two scenarios to take place. So sort of the merging of those two together. Personally, I use a lot of refillable or zero fill packaging, but partly it's my job, so I'm sort of well aware of it and very focused on it. But another phrase, it builds on the sentiments, some of the sentiments that Paul was expressing, is we need to make sure that these are accessible to everybody. We need to make sure that these are affordable. We need to ensure that these deliver equality, this notion of a just transition to a circular economy. And all of those factors, sort of need together and come and see how we play out. But I think that, broadly speaking, they're right. And, looking forward to seeing how far we can go.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. James, I'm going to come to you next. Now, please tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm working under the assumption that you may well have participated in the workshop where we've got people across the industry and the supply chains coming together to talk about this. So I'll be interested to hear almost your kind of gut feel from what you heard on that session, as well as your own personal perspective.
I think that I don't think my personal perspective in the end was miles away from the feeling in the room for the virtual room for those seminars. I think as industry and the edges of industry, which is where I sit, and the sort of current packaging industry side, it is very, very difficult to imagine these scenarios in the context of a seminar, in the way that we did it. It is very difficult for current industry to imagine such a different future, and I'm absolutely no different. So I thought that obviously the seminars themselves are very good, gave some very good insight, but there was this initial hurdle of getting people over that first step of imagining something different, and that came out really, really loud and clear. I would say, in terms of my own view, I mean, you think about these things in the way that you live your life at present, I think, and I probably would have. I mean, I've got 3 children under 11 in a busy household. So if you're thinking of the here and now, it's not just, I mean, I made a point in the chat, but it isn't just that. I mean, financial affordability is an important factor, and you would hope that by 2050 it shouldn't be a differentiating factor between participation in some sort of circular packaging or not, because to the point that's been made straight after me, price should level out. But when you apply it to the current day context, there's other affordabilities as well. It's the time. It feels like a hurdle, and I'm in the industry. I do my bit. It feels like a hurdle to remember and to do more, because we're so used to where we are at the current time. So you have to kind of almost step back from that, and I think we got the participants to an extent to do this. Step back from the current here and now and how they feel, and think about almost like paint scenario 1, the business as usual scenario, as an unacceptable future. So what's going to be different, and kind of we evolved it to kind of doing it that way. And I agree with what Nick said. It feels like, for me, and possibly for the people in the room, that's say that too confidently, but it does feel like that combination. It feels like elements of some of the scenarios would facilitate success in others. There is no way we'll get to a sustainable future, to my mind, without considering all 4 of those scenarios and the combined additional benefit of combining them together, if you see what I mean. So I think what Nick said was perfect really on it. It is the combination of those things after you've got that, over that initial hurdle of things do have to change, and you have to suspend your financial and other affordability and capability to embrace the future.
And I think I'll come back to that if you don't mind, but linking it to both the sort of current people who are in the supply chain and potential, what potential there is for new people to enter. Paul, your kind of initial comments kicked this off. I don't know whether you've got anything further you want to say, having heard what Nick and James have said.
So I wrote some things down and I've crossed off those that Nick and James have said, so I don't need to repeat that. So I'll just give you a couple more. Firstly, of course, the UK economy is a developed economy, and it's a very different economy to other nations, particularly developing nations. We've got to remember that. It's very different as well to agricultural economies. And I suspect, and in fact, we know that the move from rural to urban living to city living is going to be a continued mass movement of people around the world. I go back to the geopolitics. That movement of people around the world will also be as a result of geopolitical disasters, climate change, and other things, and that will need to be taken into account. There will also be the continued move to a burgeoning middle class in developing countries, and the experience thus far is that the middle class, once they have the affordability, they do become consumers. They consume and they want their needs met. So we'll have to deal with that. Second thing, this is so obvious. This report from 2022 looking to 2050 is akin to a report written in 1990 looking at how life might be like now. I don't know any report exists that's got it right, that foresaw where technology innovation, where how we live will take us, nor indeed in developed economies, how we've moved away from a life based on things, or a less life based on things compared to a life based on experiences, and towards the service economy. So that, I think, resonates from me, and this comes out, I think, a lot in the document. The third thing it does for me is that really it asks questions. I mean, how often, how much time do we spend in the day really planning our time? I'm told that we should spend 30% of our time planning for the future. I don't get 30% of my time spent on that. All of my time seems to be spent on government consultations, firefighting, dealing with things now, the next email, the next issue that comes up in the inbox. So it's an opportunity for me to look at this report and just take some time out and think about things. Whether I agree with it is almost not the issue. It's the extent to which I think about it, seriously, the extent to which I look at it and it prompts questions in my own mind, and the extent to which we try, all of us, to have common goals towards the same things. Because if we're disunited in what our goals are, we're likely to increase inefficiency of resources and have less security. And finally, if I may, Bruce, Ellen MacArthur's circular economy diagram, we all know it so well. The analogy I use is that we're coming up to summer holidays now, where if your parents or uncles, aunties, grandparents, and you've got kids in the car and you're on a journey, the most often asked question in the car is this one, which is, are we there yet? And that is the question I ask myself every time I see the Ellen MacArthur circular economy diagram. We have for a long time now, all of us, been working towards a circular economy, and indeed we may never fully reach it. But when will we reach a stage where we can look at the circular economy diagram and think, do you know what? We have actually virtually done that now for the packaging supply chain. There's a lot of that we've already done. We go into the finessing rather than a big stream of issues to do. I don't know what that year is when we will have accomplished pretty much the circular economy for packaging, but I'd like it to be before 2050.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Paul. That's great. And so the point I wanted to come back to, I mean, Dave's asking two questions at the same time, but we've spoken there about the effectively people who in the various, in the packaging industry, in the industries that feed materials into the packaging industries, and I'm seeing exactly the same thing here in terms of foundation industries. There is that absolute hurdle that James talked about to get over from this is where we are, this is how we've been operating potentially for decades. We've almost a mental hurdle to get over to be able to take the step. And as we've done this kind of analysis, looking at the foundation industries themselves, what has become apparent is that through innovation and other avenues, we need to at least invigorate some element of churn in terms of both the thinking of the people who are already there and bringing new people and new ideas into the supply chains to make some of that happen. So I guess my follow-on question is, how important do you think that's going to be as an enabler of hitting that target, Paul, hopefully well in advance of 2050? Or do you think actually it's probably not going to happen? We've just got to go from where we are, get the people who are involved in the industry over that mental hurdle, show them time and time again that first scenario. I mean, I well remember the time when I worked at Tata Steel, taking Tata Group executives to see the ice cores in Cambridge at the British Antarctic Survey and going, here is the evidence that this is real. And then we took them away and gave them a lecture and said, this is real. If we do nothing about it, this is what's going to happen. Basically to scare them, yeah? And then you take them through the process of, okay, now you're scared, but it is possible for you individually to do something about it. You're a senior leader in an important industry. You can make choices that will take us in the right direction. So if you've got any thoughts along those lines, perhaps could I start with you, Paul, first, if that's all right?
Okay, so it's a quick one. The rhetoric is there. How many COP meetings have we had? Well, it's at least 26, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But we saw how difficult it is to turn the rhetoric, the fine words, into agreements that have substance that the governments around the world can agree to. And there is nearly always a negotiation process, a bargaining process, a transactional process almost between the governments on something which now is existential. And I do feel that the governments have the key role in this, the leadership that they are able to put in place, the frameworks that they put in place, the level playing fields that they put in place in order that everybody has to move towards the most ambitious goals that we can is lacking. It's not there. I'm sure that Greta Thunberg, if she were here, would give us her own views about that. I think then there is also the firefighting that we see at the moment, the supply chain upheavals in order to supply the goods and things that we need in our economy versus is that the right trajectory to where we need to be for climate change, for biodiversity loss? And of course, there's a mismatch. There are a great number of organizations that are pushing as hard as they can on that, but by no means all. I saw a great question, was it in the chat, in the Q&A earlier from anonymous attendee, how much of a cost is it for supermarkets to make the transition to only recyclable packaging? And I would say that the journey is ongoing, and I don't say that as a cop out, far from it. But we've come from a particular starting point that all of us have inherited from our predecessors in the economy. There's very rarely a job I've ever been in where I could actually decide to change things overnight myself. I don't have that power, never have. So I inherit the systems I've got and I do my best. But I will say this, that I just heard recently that one local council in Wales has a recycling rate of 70% of its everything coming out from households. And of course, that must include food waste and green gardeners waste as well. But it also includes a lot of packaging. And about 80% of all of the packaging, all of those 40,000 different items you can buy in a decent sized supermarket, a great number of those will have recyclable packaging, and a great number of those will have packaging that has recycled content. It's not perfect at the moment, but we can only have recycling rates in this country up in the 70% if the packaging itself is recyclable. One of our biggest issues, and I'll just finalize on this, is capture. It does seem to me, even coming back to the plastics issues that Nick raised earlier, it does seem to me that if the supply chain has got its act together on, for example, recyclable beverage packaging, and it's 100% recyclable, but we're only capturing half of it, then it's not entirely down to the supermarkets. Actually, there are actions needed across the whole of the supply chain. And dare I say it, also for citizens. Thank you.
Nick, James, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in if that's okay, Nick. Yeah, agree with everything that Paul has said. On a bit of a more basic level, I think that there is this, and tying to your point about the example from Tata Steel and change, and Paul's point about are we nearly there yet? It will feel like we can see where we're going. To me, it'll feel like we can see where we're going when the internal dialogue from this changes. This isn't going to sound very miserable, but it's not supposed to. From feeling good about doing something to feeling bad about not. And if I take that right back down to the most simple example I can think of, which is packaging recycling in the current day, from the household, and this isn't to say we can recycle our way out of this this crisis. That is not what I'm saying. But if you take that example, I still feel that there is a glow about recycling and a whole load of justifications and excuses why you don't have to. The classic one being it's complicated. Isn't complicated. People councils work really hard, give really simple guidance to pick up stuff from your actual doorstep. You can strive to find that complicated. You can find complexities in anything. Everyone goes round and roundabout, very rarely crashes. You can find complexities in lots of things if you're looking for them. But the fundamental core things are the rules to recycling at home are plastic bottles, pots, tubs, and trays. Do your best. Get as much that you think is appropriate in, and councils are very good at sorting it out. But make that initial assessment on what are actually relatively simple. No, they are very simple criteria. But there's this kind of like glow about doing something simple in that stage, which goes right through possibly even to the board of Tata Steel. A glow about doing something good. Well, no, we're nearly there. When the glow is gone, and it's just a guilt about not participating, in my opinion. That was a bit soapboxy, Bruce. Sorry about that, but I'll hand over to Nick.
We're very much in that mode this morning. And then I need to come back to one focus question that both my team and stakeholders across the foundation industries will kill me if I don't ask you. So, but first, Nick, any comments on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we do have to scare people. I mean, my opinion is that the message is filtering through, but not quickly enough. I see more and more, like you say, more and more senior people seem to be taking this more and more seriously. There's plenty of innovation out there, never lacked for technical innovation. Perhaps the bigger challenge is system innovation. How do you integrate all these, it's tricky. I mean, the question regarding, the cost of supermarkets. Well, it's a good question. Do you want supermarkets to go so every piece of packaging is optimized for scenario 2? So simpler, monomaterial, packaging formats that fit with existing recycling formats? Or do you want supermarkets to go down the route of everything being available for refill? Because if you try to do both at once, at least, at scale, you're setting up, clashes, war between them. And it's a difficult, and it's again, to an extent, it's where you have to look for the systems that govern and rule societies as a whole. So you would hope that, although to some extent, yet more as Paul said, yet more legislation or draft legislation to comment on. But, I don't know. All I do know, and I'm sure everyone feels the same thing, is that the clock is ticking out, and things when we used to say, oh, we've got 20 years to sort this out, we don't. We've got 10 years to sort, we don't. We have to make these decisions now. That is the only thing that I am sure of.
So I can lead nicely into my next, and what might turn out to be the final question. We'll see how long the answers are. So obviously, from the foundation industry's perspective, we sought to get this piece of work done so we'd be able to communicate with stakeholders across the foundation industries how the packaging sectors, envisage things may change in terms of their material requirements as we go through the next 2 to 3 decades. Yeah, and these scenarios are really helpful in terms of giving indicators there. But one of the other things we found as we've gone through the first 2 years of our challenge is absolutely the cross supply chain collaboration in terms of innovation has been absolutely vital in terms of bringing in new thinking, new possibilities that the individual foundation industries didn't internally have the right people to be able to understand that there were different directions that they can go. And then the collaborations through the supply chain have genuinely seemed to accelerate the pace at which innovations can be brought through and deployed. So I'm probably slightly biased because I think I've seen that within our challenge, but I'd be interested to hear from all of you how big an important piece you think that through supply chain piece, more widely, but especially in terms of innovation, is going to be in enabling us to hit these sort of targets, ideally well ahead of 2050. Nick, I'll start with you to run off the challenge.
Easy answer, Bruce. Vital. And you know, even to the extent that you have to almost stop thinking, you have to start thinking about, you know, a while ago within Innovate UK, we did a piece of work where we started trying to think about value networks, not even value chains. It's no longer about, you know, individual supply chains are great, but a lot of them are optimized, they're protected and so on and so forth. We really want to drive change. We have to think in terms of this, of supply networks, the entire system. I sort of keep coming back to it. And the only way to achieve that is by bringing people together and talking. And at the risk of you know, blowing our own trumpets, it's one of the things that are, you know, these challenge-led programs that address, you know, specific things, but are optimized and instructed and empowered to work right throughout a sector. You know, in TFI, you've got industries that might not normally talk to each other, sharing experiences, sharing understanding, sharing learning, which I've got to believe can only hope to accelerate positive change.
Thanks, Nick. James?
And if there's you know, I don't follow politics, but you know, who knows, if things are changing in the political spectrum, perhaps that message can filter out to whoever our new leaders are. Sorry, so joking, but yeah, there we go.
I don't follow politics either. I gave up days ago, which seems like years, so it's too difficult to follow. Yes, I agree with everything Nick said. I mean, collaboration is key. I think it goes back to that. I think it's a difficult thing outside of industry to land because of a lack of understanding. As right at the beginning, I mentioned, I think, about the role that packaging plays and that it is quite technical. No, it's very technical, and it is absolutely intrinsic in some really good outcomes on lots of different, not least environmental. So the situation is complex, but it doesn't matter what outside of industry really think. The collaboration can happen within industry, and it's completely clear. Everything that Nick said, we're not going to get anywhere without such collaboration, really. And if we can take you know, outside of industry along with us, that will generate minds for the future as well. To your point about new ideas coming into the industry, that is critical too.
Thanks, James. And Paul?
So again, I'm not going to repeat what colleagues have already said, so I'm just going to focus on these 2 points. When recycling started in the 1990s, it was new. And I remember taking all my stuff to bottle banks or paper banks, not the curbside service. That's not the case now. Recycling is now mainstream. But is it for everyone mainstream? And I ask this, we have 67 million people in the UK, and we've got 4.6 million businesses. And at the moment, recycling and the behavior of recycling is voluntary, and it is on an opt-in basis. And local councils and retailers and brands spend a lot of money and energy and time convincing people of the value of recycling the things that is taking into their home or that they use out and about. Very sadly, about 25% of the population, as I understand it from RAP figures, aren't regular recyclers or recycle at all. And of the 4.6 million businesses, many of those businesses don't have a recycling service. So I asked this question, this is my first thing. We're now in the 21st century. Recycling should be the easiest of all things that we get right, as Glenn in the chat has just said. Why are we still happy to allow all of that on an opt-in basis if we feel like it, if it takes our fancy? Shouldn't recycling, if you have a service provided to your home or to your business, be mandatory? And my personal view is, yes, it should, and it should be enforced. The second thing in my mind is that even when you do the right thing on recycling, and I think it was RAP's behaviour change part of its business. I saw a slide at the Resourcing the Future conference a few weeks ago, and it gave a picture, I think it was 2009 to 2019, that it asked the citizens in their surveys to what extent do they feel that they are themselves mitigating all of their carbon emissions and so on. And you won't be surprised to hear, but it's nice to see the backup from the citizens themselves in one way, which is that citizens felt that so long as they were recycling, and in 2019, so long as they were anti-plastic, job done. They do not need to worry about their carbon emissions. They do not need to worry about biodiversity. So long as they do those two things, fine, they are happy with that. So I would say that we've got some big cultural issues in the UK that we still need to grapple, the realities and the acceptability of what we do. And secondly, I think we've got to reel up about to the extent to which we require businesses and people to recycle and do other environmental goods in order to be able to meet the challenges we've got. Those are my two thoughts.
Oh, fantastic, Paul. Yeah, and I completely agree with those. James?
I was just going to say that will extend as well, of course, to some of the scenarios outlined for 2050. That extends to we get it nailed for recycling. Then for the products for which it is best to employ reuse or a returnable pre-fill, all those sorts of things. That behaviour extends. It has to become the social norm by one mean or another. I'm sorry, Paul. Just
well, and if I may, Bruce, not that I want to have a big conversation with James now, that we always have good conversations. I think we would probably agree that the world in 2050 is going to be more advanced, better in so many ways than it is now. And issues that we grapple with now, I think we all feel, well, by 2050, surely the governments, we will have all woken up to the need to sort it out. But if all of that doesn't happen by 2050 or happens in 2050, we'll have missed the whole purpose of what it is we're doing here. So I ask this question: if it's not in 2050, then what year before then will some of these big issues be sorted out? When will it be mandatory to recycle? When will reuse take off in a very big way? When will repair be a major facet of our lives and we see repair shops on the high street to the same status as other organizations? I don't want to wait to 2050 for that. I want to see that before 2030, but how is it going to happen? And that goes back to your question of, well, who are the leaders? Who are the people in the positions, in the roles that can make that happen? And I think we've got to find them, we've got to get them on our side, and we've got to help them to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree. Well, all of a sudden, the clock is starting to race away from us. We've only a few minutes left. So what I'm going to do is ask each of you to consider all that we've discussed today, and I suppose if there's anything that you think we've not touched on, you could bring that as well. Give an indication of what you think is your sort of most important reflection from what you've seen and heard and read. I mean, for myself, I think looking at the report and its findings and looking across the scenarios, whichever ones may contribute to different degrees over the coming decades, it has been very interesting to effectively see confirmation that the sort of materials that the foundation industries are producing to supply the packaging sector are still going to be integral to the needs of the packaging sector, in those decades to come. Somebody sat outside this discussion, not involved in the packaging sector, not involved in foundation industries, might very well just be going, well, surely we'll have completely new materials, new properties, much better environmentally, and just expect that these kind of unicorn solutions are going to suddenly appear, and there'll be no need for paper packaging, plastic packaging, steel or aluminium-based packaging. And really, the report validates for me that that's not going to be the case. These materials are going to be an inherent part of the packaging system in the future, and therefore it's vital that the foundation industries work with all those in the packaging sector to deliver on whatever the eventual outturn in terms of scenario becomes. So that's my final summary of what I've seen. Nick, could I go to you next?
Sure. I'm struck by all sorts of things. One of the things the thing that just cropped to my mind is that old thing about, I don't know, that sort of aphorism, I don't know what we'll fight World War III with, but I know what we'll fight World War IV with, and that's sticks. And it does make you think about, the pressures that we face. I don't know what necessarily the next generation of packaging materials will be, for sure. I mean, I think we've pretty much covered it in the report, but if we don't get it right, then the next generation of packaging materials will be leaves, assuming we've still got leaves wrapped around scraps of food. But a more serious note, I think that what this report tells you, if you work in the foundation industries, the thing that I would get across the most is to recognize your importance in cycling materials. No longer, Paul, as ever, are we there yet? Are we there at that circular economy? Everyone has to play their part. And if you primarily produce the materials, then you need to think really hard about where your feedstocks are coming from. We simply have to move beyond extraction and get back into cycling. And there are definitely requirements for new materials. If you're in the chemicals industry, I think you've really got to start thinking about the biofeedstocks aspect of it, whatever they're made into, and working out how you get that material back, which might not be directly in the case of biomaterials. So what part can you play in making sure that soils aren't depleted so you get your feedstocks? If you work in glass, or if you work in producing plastics or metals, how can I do it better? And how can I play a greater role in returning those materials into useful cycles? That's for me what I would take, or the one message I would get across to anyone working in the foundation industries.
Thanks, Nick, and I'll definitely carry that message forward. James?
Yes, thanks, Bruce. I think that we need to prepare immediately to move, and for the conversation to move beyond conventional discussion of collection in that conventional way and recycling in the mechanical and maybe even the chemical way. The conversation needs to get beyond that and move into the combination of those scenarios that we talked about before. And I do think, although may well prove to be wrong, but I do think a combination of scenario is going to be important. But it's getting that combination right. Nick said it perfectly. You have to do it without causing that kind of counter, that kind of conflict that actually breaks everything. Sort of aiming to pre-fill, refill, reuse on different items or different sectors, or on the same items or the same sector, or whatever. So there needs to be, so that all has to be underpinned by a roadmap of the best future and collaboration. There has to be this kind of collaborative approach to move that conversation, as I say, beyond conventional collection and recycling and into the scenarios, and so we need that kind of route map, I would say, but that'll only come through collaboration.
James, and finally, Paul.
Thank you. Well, firstly, can I just put on record my thanks to UKRI, Oak Dean Hollins, and to Valpak for this report, for this webinar, and also that you gave me a very testing interview where you challenged my thinking. And several times in that interview, and James is smiling, I had to be honest, there were some questions to which I thought, I don't know. Let me think about it. I haven't thought about it. I need to. So that's a key message about this report, which is to get into it. We can't all be experts on everything, and I'm experts on virtually nothing. I've got 3 points that I want to say. Firstly, if any of us in this webinar today are in a role where we can deliver some change, and we've all got a role, at least as a citizen, But in our work roles, if we can deliver some change, don't hold back. Be ambitious, develop and stick to your values. That's my first message. The second one, I'm in my 50s now. My generation shouldn't rely on the upcoming generations to sort out all the problems that we leave to them, their inheritance. I have an obligation, everybody in my generation, everybody still working now and in this webinar has an obligation to pull all the stops out as far as we can, to make sure we make it easier for the next generations to sort out the things that we have created and past generations before us. And thirdly, let us not forget that we are in the UK in a developed economy. Several questions in the chat relating around recycling, the provision of services, very good and understandable questions. But let's not forget, 2 billion people out of the world's population do not have a waste collection service, let alone a recycling service. And therefore, there is a responsibility of developed nations, not just on waste, but on water, land scarcity, all of these other things which contribute to climate change and to biodiversity loss. There is a responsibility for us to look at that big picture and not to focus on some of the smaller details that are relatively easy, though they are still difficult, but to actually man up and get into those big details and support each other across the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I think James might have one final point you'd like to make.
Well, it was an observation. It's not to give Paul a big head, actually, but on that interview, we didn't really challenge Paul very much. What happened was he started talking and challenged himself, and that's exactly what we need. I think that probably summarises it all quite nicely. So Paul got in the mindset. We had some initial questions and everything, and it was that kind of challenging of yourself, and he challenged us as well. Actually, in fairness, he challenged the report. So it's that kind of challenging nature. I think we need to make sure we maintain that through this dialogue and this evolution as well.
Thank you, James. My red Devon cheeks have just got redder.
Well, I want to thank you all. I mean, that's a great way to finish. I think the report and indeed the discussion we've had this morning has definitely challenged myself, my team, and I want it to challenge the wider foundation industries, both in terms of their thinking and how they work with the packaging sector to deliver well before 2050 in this area. So finally, just my thanks to Paul, James and Nick as the panel, to Anjali and her team for producing the report in the first place, and indeed for UKRI giving us this opportunity to discuss it. Thank you all, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye.